Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, or where you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you have any questions or comments, you can email them to comment@am950radio.com. So I'm going to spend part of the show, of course, talking about the election results. So I am taping this at Wednesday at 11 in the morning, and so some of the numbers that I may be giving out today may change. There's still at least I just checked before I came on, that the mayor's race in Minneapolis is still not called yet. But I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about the election and probably throwing in some stuff about the shutdown and some more about the segment I did last week right at the end where I only had a few minutes where I talked about Trump committing war crimes again. Well, I'm going to go into more depth on that because I think this is an issue that is not being covered enough. So I'm going to go through it in some more detail again. So before I get into my take on the election, I wanted to check with Patrick here, the producer of the show. Any thoughts you may have about how things turned out last night?
Well, certainly, I think it was a really great night for Democrats, of course, in New York City, and as well as the governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia. A lot of people thought that New Jersey race with Sherrill and the Republican might be, too close to call, but it was fairly clear early on that it was going to be Sherrill winning that race. And I think Virginia, that was called in about an hour, and even some of the statewide races that in Virginia that people were a little more curious about. The Democrats, I think, swept them all, and they flipped a bunch of seats, it sounded like, in the House and expanded. It was a 3-seat margin. Now it could be something like a 10 or 12 or something really overwhelmingly large.
Yeah, I mean, if you were like gaming this out before the night started, like what would be like a great night for the Democrats? I doubt that a lot of people would have, came up with or had on their bingo card all these wins. So I'm actually going to talk about some things maybe you haven't heard about, around the rest of the country. I was hearing some stuff. I mean, I was listening to the Stephanie Miller show this morning, and on my way over here, and there were people calling in saying, "Yeah, in our little city, we got rid of a bunch of Republican city council members." I mean, you're hearing all kinds of that sort of stuff at the local level, in particular. How mayors and city council members and school board members and all that. How Republicans were also got trounced there by the sounds of it. But of course, we'll know better numbers and all that as time goes on. I'm going to start out here with some election night results. So I'm going to go through some of these again. Some of these numbers may be a little bit different than what I'm leading with here, but they'll be pretty close. So as Patrick mentioned, the Virginia, the Democrats, as I looked at it, I think they won everything. I mean, they won all the statewide races. They won their House of Delegates. I mean, I'll get to that here in a little bit, but that's their version of the House of Representatives in the state legislature there. So, I mean, all of them were up for election, and the Democrats gained, I think it was 13 seats there. So, I mean, and I'm going to go through some things, even in like Mississippi and Georgia. Democrats really overperformed. And that's part of what, this election is about is like, yeah, you can say, well, yeah, you expected Democrats probably to win in the Virginia governor race. And, they had at least if you look at some of the polls, right, it's like, well, they're going to win the New Jersey governor's race. It'll be close, but they should be able to pull that one out. What is a little bit shocking to some people is like, well, the margins of victories here, like the Democrats really overperformed. So this is, as I tell my political science classes, like I'm not one who goes with polls as it relates to elections because you can't poll voter turnout. I mean, you just can't. And this is another one of these elections that, I really hope the Democrats learn from this, and I hope the people too learn from this. A lot of people are feeling good today. A lot of people are feeling good this morning. If you want this to continue, you got to keep voting in every election. From here on out, you just can't be satisfied with this one and say, oh, my job's done. Because you got to keep voting, and you got to keep voting, and you got to keep voting. Otherwise, all of this is for naught. So when the Democrats come out and vote, and I think you'll see that the turnout rates were pretty darn good for an off-year election, so to speak, Democrats won. Again, not just in the statewide races, the more covered races, but also at the local levels. So Abigail Spanberger, she became the first female governor in Virginia history by winning. And by the way, she ran against a Republican female candidate, so whoever won that was going to be the first female governor in Virginia history. So she became that person. She won by roughly 14, 15 points. And she was a former House of Representatives member from Virginia. Mikey Sherrill, who's a former House of Representatives member in New Jersey, she won hers by roughly 56 to 43, somewhere in there. Like a 11, 12-point win. Double digits anyway. And in both of those races, the Democrats overperformed what Harris got in 2024. And in some places in those two states, the Republicans went down from what Trump got in 2024 in those Democratic states. So there were some signs, there was a lot of people saying, that New Jersey governor's race is going to be close, like Patrick was mentioning there, but didn't turn out to be that way. And this was because the Democrats, showed up in an off-year election and won going away pretty much. And they won pretty much all the significant elections last night. So, of course, another one that everybody was watching was New York City Mayor, where Zoran Mamdani. I've talked about that race before. I'm going to circle back to that here in a little bit. But he won despite literally millions of dollars of attack ads being used against him in the closing weeks of the race, in favor of Andrew Cuomo. I mean, even Trump endorsed Cuomo. Trump didn't even endorse the Republican. What does that tell you about who he's trying, who he supports? It's like, geez. But, he won by, roughly 10, maybe 9 or 10 points, somewhere in there, last that I looked. And, in Virginia, as I mentioned, the Democrats won so they flipped the governor seat, because that was held by a Republican. They flipped the lieutenant governor seat. That was held by a Republican. They flipped the attorney general seat in Virginia. That was a Republican. And they gained, I think the last count that I saw was 13 seats in the House of Delegates in Virginia. So they had a slim lead at the beginning, and now it's 64 to 35 Democrats, and there was still one, at least the last time I looked. Maybe that's changed by now, but there was one seat that was still, they hadn't called yet. So that one could go either way. But at least thus far, they've gained 13 seats. That was a huge win. So Democrats won everything in Virginia. So now the Democrats have the trifecta in Virginia because they already had the Senate as well. So now they have the state Senate, they have the state House of Delegates, and now they have the governor position in Virginia. So there's a lot of speculation out there that when they take over in January, one of the first things they're going to do is move to do redistricting in that state. And, why not after these election results, right? It's like, you want to talk about having a mandate. I mean, flipping 13 seats is, that's a mandate. In a 100 seat house. So So those were, some of the ones that, a lot of the people were looking at. But I want to talk about some things about, for example, in Pennsylvania, there were 3 Democratic Supreme Court justices up for a retention election. So Pennsylvania is one of those states for some of their judges, they do what's called a retention election. This has been brought up in Minnesota, but it is not law in Minnesota. But it is in Pennsylvania, where after you get like a 10-year term, and then at the end of the 10 years, the people get to vote to either retain you or not. So there were 3 Democrats up in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the Republicans literally, again, spent millions of dollars trying to unseat them. And they all won by roughly a 60-40 vote. So, again, it wasn't even that close, despite the fact that there were millions of dollars spent trying to get rid of them. And remember, Trump won Pennsylvania in 2024. So that was, a year ago. And now you get about roughly 60-40 vote to keep the Democratic judges on the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. So this is another example of how the Republicans got, they got their clocks clean in this election. So at the national level, right, it's a pretty good night for the Democrats. Not a good night for Republicans. Of course, Fox News is, and I use that term loosely. Usually, I call them Fox Lies for a reason. But they're going crazy over there. Trump, of course, is going crazy about the election was rigged and how a communist won in New York City and all these things. He's just going nuts. And by that, that he's running scared now. He's panicking. And I think so are the Republicans. How can't they, given the results? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these other results here. But, one of the big questions now is like, okay, now that the Republicans got shellacked, are they going to change what they're doing at the national level, with the shutdown and that kind of thing? And they apparently they had a meeting with Trump this morning, and by the sounds of it, no, they're not going to do anything different. Now, the question is going to be one thing that they may do different, because this is what Trump has been demanding of John Thune, right, the majority leader in the Senate, is get rid of the filibuster. And he was truth socialing or whatever they call it over there, in the middle of the night too. Got to get rid of the filibuster, So we'll see. As I've said before, that they can end this they can end the shutdown by getting rid of the filibuster. Of course, there's certainly political risk to doing that, and they've resisted that. The Republicans that thus far in the Senate have said, "No, we're not going to do that." But after this election result, who knows what they're going to do? But they're already complaining about the results and how they're rigged, and the country's going to hell. The socialists and the communists and the Marxists are going to take over, and oh my God. So, of course, one thing that I'm looking for is whether Andrew Cuomo now is going to move to Florida. Because he said, hey, if I lose this election, I'm going to move out of New York and I'm going to move down to Florida. Okay, bye-bye. See you later, Andrew. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, right? Now, we'll have to see if he actually does it. But, if he's a man of his word, then he's got to go. He's got to go down to Florida. And I think New York City will be better off without him, quite frankly. So the other one of the main things that was on the ballot last night was over in California, where nobody was on the ballot in California, but Proposition 50, as it was called. This is the something I've talked on previous shows about is how the California legislature put it up to the voters for the voters to choose whether to redistrict their House maps to gain up to 5 Democratic seats in the House. And that also overwhelmingly passed. Now, the last numbers I saw was like low 60s approving it. California, it takes a little while to, get all their votes in. But, it was roughly a little over 60% to, 38 or something like that. So another easy win there. But one thing that I saw last night was, the turnout there. Again, nobody was on the ballot. They had no elect. This was the only thing that they had to do in California. And this was an opportunity for them to be basically their own representative, right? I've talked before about in some states, not Minnesota, but in some states, if you get enough signatures, right, you can get a initiative out there. I'll be coming back to that here in a little bit with the state of Maine. Or you have a referendum like you have in Minnesota where the state legislature can say, yeah, we're going to let the people vote on this stuff. Well, that's what they did in California too. It's like, okay, we're gonna let the people vote on whether we can do this, and it won pretty easily. But the lines, I saw on some shows last night were just long. The turnout there was pretty big again for an election where nobody was on the ballot. So this is an example of how the people can fight back against fascism. Right, as I've said over and over, one thing you can do is show up and vote. If you haven't voted before, get out there and do it now. And get all your friends, people that don't vote, get them out there. Right, and this night or last night showed what can happen when the Democrats get their butts out there and vote. This is one of the things that people can do to stand up to a fascist regime. So now, again, I've said earlier that, I don't think California should have limited itself to 5 seats, but, they were trying to combat what Texas was doing. So, that's going to happen. Now, again, you may see some lawsuits and all that, but I don't think they're going to succeed. So given how that turned out in California, the interesting thing moving forward is going to be, are more Democratic states going to start doing this? States where the Democrats have the trifecta. Now, it's not as many states as the Republicans have, but Maryland's Governor Wes Moore was out last night saying, yeah, we're going to form a commission in Maryland to look at this, to look at whether they should do this or not. So will other Democratic states look at this and say, hey, the people overwhelmingly supported it. Why shouldn't we do it here? This is what the Democratic base wants. So let's do it here. Because after getting shellacked, that more Republican states are now going to look at doing this to try and keep the House, to try and cheat to win. Because that's the only way they're going to win. With results like this, if it's similar results in a year from now, they're going to get killed. It's not going to be a slim victory for the Democrats. It's going to be like they had in Virginia where, 13 seats in a place that have 100 delegates. So if you multiply that by 4, in a 435 seat House of Representatives at the federal level, that's a lot of people. Right? That could be like 2018 numbers where the Democrats took over the House quite convincingly. So I'm going to take my first break here. Going to come back, talk more about the election results. So we'll see you on the other side of the break here on Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, welcome back to Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Again, thanks for tuning into this post-election show. So we're going to continue on with some other things that happened during the election. So I had mentioned Maine earlier, right? So Maine is one of those states where if you get enough people signing petitions, you can vote on things. So in Maine, they had 2 things they were voting on. Again, there wasn't anybody on the ballot in Maine, like for governor or anything. but there were a couple of issues to vote on. So one of them was the Republicans trying to get voter ID and other restrictive, other restrictions on mail-in voting and less early voting and all those sorts of things. Right? This is all voter suppression tactics that Republicans are trying to do in all the states because they think it benefits them and hurts the turnout for the Democrats. Well, in Maine, which has elected some Republicans before, the voters rejected it 61 to 39%. So, back in, what was it, 2012 or 2014 in Minnesota or 2010 maybe, in Minnesota we rejected voter ID. Well, Maine has now as well, and all these other restrictions that Republicans are trying to do. Now, the Democrats in Maine put up something as well that they voted on, and this was to add red flag laws for guns. Right? Minnesota, passed a law after, taking over in 2023. So the people in Maine voted to do this, to have red flag laws by 60 to 40%. So again, big win there. Wasn't even close. So in Maine, of all places, you got, the Republicans losing big on their voter ID laws and voter restriction laws attempt there. And the red flag laws on guns, winning pretty easily. So this is another example. So you had that in California, and you had that in Maine, where the people, knew what their job was. So that, there wasn't anybody on these elections. It was just voting on these issues. And they knew what their job was, to vote for freedom. Right? And they did their jobs. Even though, in some places there were these poll monitors, that the Justice Department put out there. But, this was a big deal. And let's not forget in California, I mean, that thing, they barely had like 2 months, if even that long, to pull all that together and, get it out for a vote. And it was overwhelmingly approved. So getting back to Zoran Mamdani's win. So let's not forget that nobody heard about this guy like a year ago. I mean, he was a member of the New York Assembly, so their version of the House of Representatives in their state legislature, and he's only 34 years old. I mean, he's a real young guy, and I had. As I've said on a previous show, I had seen some of his stuff that he did right after the election. He went out and was talking to people about why did you vote for Trump, right? He was trying to get some reasons why people were voting for Trump. And so that was like my first time where I actually saw him and heard about him, and it just kind of grew from there where hardly anybody knew him. And then he, announced he was going to run for mayor of New York City, and for the longest time, he wasn't polling hardly at all. And then all of a sudden, once he started getting more people noticing him, and the debate started, and he was on some of these shows, and people started hearing what his messaging was. I mean, nobody could stop him. And the thing with him is he ran saying, "Yeah, I am a democratic socialist." He wasn't trying to hide it. Right, everybody was calling him, all the Republicans were calling him a commie or a Marxist or a socialist or, whatever. He didn't hide it. He embraced it. I mean, he was even, doing it last night in his acceptance speech. So, the last numbers that I saw was he won, I think he had like 50.4% and Cuomo had 41.6%, something like that. So, yeah, and you're already seeing, the rich people in New York City are saying, we're going to leave. They were saying that before the election, and now they're like, oh, we don't want our taxes to go up, right? It's like, oh, okay. And as I said before, bye. You can go with Andrew Cuomo. Go ahead, leave. The thing about him, the reason why I think he won, he had bold ideas, and he didn't shy away from it. And he focused on affordability in New York City. So he talked about free buses, some city-run grocery stores, like a handful of those, free child care, raising the minimum wage, freezing the rent. I mean, and there's other things, but those were kind of his main things. And he said, yeah. And when people are saying, well, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for that? He's like, we're going to tax the rich more. Pretty simple. So, in other words, he's going after the oligarchs. Right? And he won. He won the primary pretty easily over Cuomo and Eric Adams, and he won easily here. Like 9 points or so. So, the thing to watch there is, are any of these, rich guys going to leave? They're probably not going to leave. I mean, they're rich for a reason, right? I mean, they got rich there. They're going to stay there. But if they don't, fine, go. Who cares? So, this is a blueprint for the Democrats in 2026, as I've said before, is you need to run on the affordability and run against the oligarchy. It's like us versus the rich people. And when you do that, you're going to get a lot of new voters. Mom Donnie got a lot of young people who, just turned voting age, or young people who hadn't voted before. Killed that in the turnout in this election and in the primaries. He got a lot of new voters, people who people who hadn't voted before. They came out and voted for him, or people who hadn't voted in a while because they got tired of the politics, came out and voted for him. This is the script for the Democrats to follow, and they need to embrace it. They need to be bold. This is not a time to be a corporate Democrat and we can only do it around the edges, and we can't do that. We can't do this. We can't do that. Like, come on. We know that you guys are bought by the oligarchs and the rich people, and we're done with it. Campaign that way. That's what your base wants. That's what gets you turnout, as shown by this election in an off-year election. Democracy's on the line. And you have an opportunity to improve the life for everybody, for even the Republicans. Right? I think if some Democrats, I'm sure Mom Donnie got some votes from Republicans. Probably even some MAGA voters voted for him. Because he's talking about making their lives better too, not just the lives of the Democrats. It's everybody's. This is how you can win in 2026. You can get a lot of the non-voters. Heck, you might even get some, Republicans to vote for you. So, next state I'm going to talk about here a little bit is Georgia. Certainly not a blue state, although they have two Democratic senators that had to go into runoffs, which means it was really close. Well, there were two statewide races in the state of Georgia for something they call a public service commissioner. So there's 5 of them statewide. So these are like their, I think just like sort of like their public utility type boards or something. So Republicans had a 5-0 advantage on that board. Well, 2 of them were up for election last night, and the Democrats won both of those. And they were by big margins. One of them was 54 to 46%. The other one was 58 to 42. So they weren't even that close. And this is a statewide election in the state of Georgia. This is, again, a template for it. Democrats. You got to start doing this, and you got to start doing this now. You can have a few days to celebrate the victories here, but you got to keep driving this home. So in the, I'm going to switch now to a few local, some Minnesota elections here. So in the Minnesota Senate, there were 2 special elections, and one was for a Republican-held seat, one was for a Democrat-held seat. So the Republican passed away in office, and the Democrat, that was Nicole Mitchell, so she quit after she was convicted of a felony. So, as expected, the Republican won that seat, Democrat won the other one, and so now we're back to a one vote advantage for the DFL in the Senate, and we're still tied in the House. So, Minnesota DFL State Party, start getting ready for the next election, right? Run on the stuff that these candidates did nationwide, and run on the things that Mom Donnie did. Your base wants this stuff. You will get more of them out to vote, right? So there was sort of like one surprise election. Now, I wasn't totally surprised by this, but Melvin Carter, the mayor in St. Paul, lost to I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but Kaoli Her, who actually worked for him earlier, and then she was a state house member, I believe. So she got in rather late to this race. And I think one reason why she got into this race was because there was a lot of people, a lot of Democrats, that didn't like what Melvin Carter was doing. I have a number of friends in St. Paul. Some of them, casual acquaintances, some of them pretty good friends. They were not Melvin Carter fans. And, he lost on the using ranked choice voting, where, he did not get 50% initially. He was only ahead by, I think it was 3% after the first, first round. And he ended up losing 48 to 45%. So the got a new mayor in St. Paul, also in St. Paul. So I think this may be the first St. Paul mayor that's a female. I'm going to have to check again on that, but I thought I had heard that was the case here. Plus, all the city council is also have women on the seats. So the mayor and all the city council in St. Paul are women. No. You don't see that very often. But, good for St. Paul. And we'll see how that turns out over there. So, yeah, some of the things I was hearing about Carter was, people were like, hey, he's going for a third term. Some people just don't want people to keep on serving. 2 terms is enough. Right? That's something that, we know with the president, and, that's kind of in some people's minds, like, hey, 2 terms is enough. Just like, you're hearing a lot of people saying that about Governor Walz. 2 terms is enough. Why are you trying for a third? So there were, some people were feeling that with Mr. Carter. And, some of the stuff that he was talking about, that he wanted to get done in St. Paul just didn't get done. Or some things that were done didn't, a lot of people didn't like it. So when you got that going against you as well, again, I'm not too surprised that he ended up losing. There's certainly a lot of people who are, because, the new mayor, she didn't have that long to campaign. But so a lot of people are saying, well, that's a major upset. I'm like, I don't call it a major upset, because I was not hearing good things about Carter's chances over there. I mean, I had heard that, it's going to be close. And it turns out, it was. And he ended up losing because of ranked choice voting. So before I went on the air here, I checked about the Minneapolis mayor, because that's also they got to do ranked choice voting over there, because Jacob Fry did not get to 50% threshold, so now they're going through and doing the ranked choice voting over there. Last I saw, he was up, in the first round, he was up by like 10 or so, I think it was. So he's likely, unless a lot of these ballots, put Omar Fatah as like their second choice. Because there was like 14 people that ran for that seat, I think it was. So, but he's probably going to win. But one thing to point out is when he ran last time, there were a lot of people saying, get the ranked choice voting. Don't put him on your ballot, for any of your choices. And he still ended up winning. He got over that 50% threshold last time he ran. He didn't do it here, though. He got just under 42% with the first go-around here. So he's lost some support over there. But, he may be he may be pulling it out. Sounds like he probably will, but still, it's not, he's lost some support where they're going to the ranked choice voting now. So, a couple other things about that election. State of Colorado, passed a ballot measure to tax the rich more to pay for free school lunches for kids in their in their schools. So Minnesota passed a law through the legislature that did that. Well, now Colorado just passed a measure where they're going to do it, and they're going to tax the rich to get the money to do it. J.D. Vance's brother ran for mayor in Cincinnati and lost. I bet J.D. feels bad today, right? So we're going to take our next break here. Probably come back and wrap up the election here a little bit, and then move on to Trump doing more war crimes. So we'll talk to you on the other side of the break here on Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. Welcome back to the third and final segment today on Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch, here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Thanks again for tuning into the show. So while we were on break here, Jacob Frey has now been declared the winner of the mayor's race in Minneapolis. So looks like he got it there. Even again, not that surprising given how the first choices came out. But again, he lost some support because last time he ran, he was able to get over the 50%, but not this time. But he has now been declared the winner. So one other thing that I wanted to bring up about the election, besides it being a big win for the Democrats, is that unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong here, but I was scrolling through some of the school referendums in rural areas, because I talked about this before on my show where, all the Department of Education is cutting all this money right to the schools, and how they were going to have to do referendums to get, money. And I saw a lot of no votes on those referendums in rural areas. So you might start seeing, unless something happens at the state level, you might start seeing some of these rural schools starting to close because they're just not going to get enough money, or you're going to see them like consolidate with somebody else, or get rid of sports maybe, and try and save money that way. I mean, but a lot of them are going to have to do some big changes in order to keep their schools open, because there were a lot of no votes in rural areas last night, which is unfortunate, I think. But this is what they voted for, right? They have a choice, and if they want to lose their elementary or high schools, well, it's their choice, right? So, all right. So So on this segment, I want to talk a little bit more about, what Trump and the Department of Defense are doing, just blowing up these ships. I've talked about this before. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people in the media are not covering this like it should be covered. You see more independent media sources talking about this than you do the mainstream media. But basically, Trump has come out and he keeps saying, yeah, we're just going to kill these drug dealers, alleged. They've shown no evidence. And even if they did, as I've said before, even if these people are hardcore drug runners, you can't just blow them up and kill them on the high seas. That is a war crime. That is murder. Okay? But it doesn't seem to care to Trump. And it also doesn't seem to the Republican Party cares either, because nobody's trying to stop them. The only one that's come out and said anything about this is Rand Paul, who at least one of them is talking about it. But, here's the thing. None of these boats can reach the United States, on their own. They got to stop numerous times to get more gas. I mean, there's no, emergency here. Trump cannot just come out and say, well, these are, he calls them narco-terrorists. That's his term. To claim that he can just murder these people. There's been no declaration of war. Remember, Congress declares war, not the president, under our system. And he's out there claiming, well, these are narco-terrorists, so we can just blow them up. Of course, they give you no evidence that that's what these people are. You would think that if they had all this evidence, they would put it out there to, justify what they're doing. But of course, they don't have the evidence. That's why they're not putting any out. By doing this stuff, it violates international law. It's a war crime. Even if these people are, legit drug dealers, you can't just murder them. What you should be doing is stopping them, boarding them, finding the drugs, arresting them, taking the drugs, charging them with crimes, and, giving them due process. There's no due process here. You got some people sitting around saying, oh, that looks like a drug boat. Let's bomb that one. Boom. Dead. Now, the last count that I saw, and this is just an estimate, of course, because they're not putting out all the evidence, probably. But 16 boats have been blown up now, last count. And at least 66 people have been killed. Now, let me say that again. 66 people have been killed just because they're out on boats and they're alleged drug dealers. Again, even assuming that they are drug dealers, that doesn't mean you can just kill them because you think they're drug dealers. Does this mean that Trump is going to start killing drug dealers in the United States because they're drug dealers? Is he going to start killing people who he thinks are Antifa? You are a domestic terrorist, so I can kill you now. I mean, that may sound a little out there for some people, but he's blowing up people in the ocean that he has at least he hasn't provided any evidence that they're drug dealers. And even if they are, he's just killing them. This is the President of the United States doing this. If Joe Biden was doing this, do you think, the press would just do nothing? Of course they wouldn't. They'd be all over this. They'd be saying, Republicans would say, impeach him. But not when Republicans do it. It's basically business as usual here. All they're doing is saying, well, you just trust us. It's like, okay, no way. All you do is lie. Why should we trust you? Well, let's not forget that the Navy admiral who was in charge of that Venezuelan area, right? He quit 2 weeks ago. He's not speaking out yet. Maybe he will. Let's hope he does about this. And, nobody wants to bring him in front of a committee to question him. Well, why not? Well, because they know they don't want him talking. Because he might just say, yeah, this is a war crime. And this whole justification is, well, you're running fentanyl. It's like, no. I said this on the last show. There's no evidence that Venezuela makes, that the drug gangs are running fentanyl across the world. They don't even make it there. But, who cares about the facts? That doesn't get it in the way for the Republicans. This lie is getting as bad as George W. Bush's lie about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. He didn't, but we invaded Iraq anyway and killed millions of people. You know why they're doing this. You know why the Trump administration is doing this. They want the oil and they want the minerals in Venezuela. It's simple as that. They want to make themselves more money. By the way, some of those tapes that they're showing you of them blowing up boats, some of those, it's been determined, were blown up in 2012, not 2025. I mean, they can't even get that right. Which, again, just shows you they're making all this up. I mean, they're not even briefing Congress about what they're doing here. A Democrat was at one of the Armed Services Committee meeting in the House, and this person came out, told a reporter that the Pentagon said they reserve the right to kill people who are, quote, affiliated, close quote, with these narco-terror groups. What the hell does affiliated mean? You may wonder. Well, they refused to answer that question when they were asked about it. They're just going to make up something to say you're affiliated with these troops, so we can kill you too. Not only the drug dealers, but anybody who's like helping them out, I guess, or giving them money. We're going to kill you. We're just unilaterally killing civilians. Just because. And I think this is one reason why the Republicans got their ass kicked in the election. This and many other things going on. But I really hope the mainstream media picks up this story and starts looking into this more, because 66 people are dead with no due process, just murdered by the Trump administration. He's acting like a dictator here, right? He's the judge, the jury, and the executioner of those people. Plain and simple. Ugh. Well, we got some good news here, so we will see you next week.